liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the April 8, 2020 edition of Space News. This is Peter Aylward, and tonight I'm joined by Tina Stagg and Michael Abdullah, and we're all from the Space Association of Australia. So let's get started with some Southern Hemisphere space news. Rocket Lab is optimistic about its long-term prospects despite the current hiatus in launches. The company's Electron launches in New Zealand are on hold because of the coronavirus pandemic, but a Rocket Lab executive said last week it expects to resume monthly launches later this year. Demand for launches, including from the US government agencies, remains strong with its 2020 manifest full and 2021 starting to fill up. The company is using the break in launches to focus more attention on development of its Photon satellite platform. And over to you, Tina.
Thank you, Peter, and good evening, space fans. In NASA news, more than 12,000 people submitted applications in NASA's latest astronaut selection round. The deadline for applications was last Tuesday, with the agency now starting a selection process that will end with a new astronaut class in the northern summer of 2021. NASA increased the educational requirements in this round and shortened the application period from 2 months to 1. And the worm has turned. NASA is bringing back its iconic worm logo. The logo, which was in use from the mid-1970s until 1992, will see limited use initially, starting with the Falcon 9 rocket that will launch the Demo 2 commercial crew mission as soon as next month. The meatball logo from the agency's early history, brought back in the 1990s, remains the main logo for the agency, and NASA said it is still assessing how and where the worm logo will be used. And to NASA's commercial crew program, NASA has assigned 2 more astronauts to the first operational SpaceX commercial crew flight, including one with an Australian connection. NASA astronaut Shannon Walker and JAXA astronaut Soichi Noguchi will fly on the Crew 1 mission, joining NASA astronauts Mike Hopkins and Vic Glover, who were assigned to the mission back in 2018. And in a local connection to the mission, Shannon Walker is the wife of retired Australian-born NASA astronaut Andy Thomas. A date for the mission has not been set and will depend on when the Demo 2 crewed test flight takes place and its outcome. No Russian cosmonauts were assigned to the mission, despite desires previously expressed by NASA for mixed crews on both Soyuz and commercial crew flights, which would ensure there would be at least 1 American and 1 Russian on the International Space Station in the event one vehicle was unavailable. At an ISS Advisory Committee meeting last week, Chairman and former Apollo astronaut Tom Stafford said Roscosmos officials did not want to assign cosmonauts to commercial crew flights until there had been successful launches. And further to our story in last week's space news, NASA has selected SpaceX to provide cargo delivery services for the Lunar Gateway. The agency awarded a Gateway Logistics Services contract to SpaceX to transport cargo to and from the Gateway, a service modelled on the commercial cargo program for the International Space Station. SpaceX plans to use a new version of its Dragon spacecraft called Dragon XL, which will transport more than 5 metric tonnes of cargo to the Gateway when launched on a Falcon Heavy. NASA did not disclose the value of the Indefinite Delivery, Indefinite Quantity Award to SpaceX. The overall Gateway Logistics Services program, which could later include other companies, has a maximum value of $7 billion across 15 years. And to NASA's planetary and space science programs, testing of NASA's James Webb Space Telescope is continuing at a reduced pace, but will soon come to a stop because of the coronavirus pandemic. NASA announced on March 20 that it had halted work on the telescope, undergoing integration and testing at a Northrop Grumman facility in Southern California, but said 5 days later it had restarted with reduced personnel. That work will end soon, the project manager for the JWST said at a committee meeting last week, because remaining work required the full team of NASA and Northrop Grumman personnel. The impact of the delayed work on the mission schedule, including a launch set for March 2021, won't be clear until after the worst of the pandemic passes. NASA is funding development of a cluster of space science CubeSats. The Sun Radio Interferometer Space Experiment, or SUNRISE, will feature 6 CubeSats positioned just above geostationary Earth orbit. The 6 satellites, flying in a formation about 10 kilometres across, will form a virtual radio telescope to detect and pinpoint emissions from the Sun associated with solar storms. The mission, with a total cost of $62.6 million, will launch by July 2023 as a hosted payload on a Maxar-built commercial satellite, deploying from that satellite after it reaches orbit. And to the US Space Force, and the Space Surveillance Radar site, known as the Space Fence, is ready for use after 5 years in construction. The Space Force said the Space Fence, a radar located on Kwajalein Island, has completed testing. The powerful radar will be able to track objects in low Earth orbit as small as a marble and is expected to significantly increase the total number of tracked objects in the catalogue maintained by the US Space Surveillance Network.
And let's move to European news. The European Space Agency is ready to support an Earth flyby of one of its missions despite the coronavirus pandemic. ESA will have a limited team of engineers at its Mission Control Centre when the Bepi Colombo spacecraft performs a gravity assist flyby of Earth on April 10 to direct the spacecraft toward its destination, Mercury. While the flyby doesn't involve manoeuvres, controllers need to monitor the spacecraft's health during the flyby, including preparing the solar-powered spacecraft for a 34-minute period when it will be in Earth's shadow. Some instruments will also be operated during the flyby. And moving to China. China's next-generation crewed spacecraft appears to use an international docking adapter. An image of the spacecraft being prepared for an uncrewed test flight next month showed a docking system that appears compatible with the International Docking System standard used on the ISS. While that could technically allow the spacecraft to dock with the station, political hurdles make such a mission unlikely for the indefinite future. And China's U-2 rover has now driven nearly 425 metres across the lunar surface. Chinese officials said the rover and the Chang'e 4 lander completed their 16th lunar day, with the rover's odometer now at 424.455 metres. The rover, which has been on the surface since January last year, holds the record for the longest operating lunar rover, and both it and the lander continue to be in good condition. And turning to Canada, the Canadian Space Agency has issued a new contract to space technology firm MDA for International Space Station operations. The $133 million contract covers engineering and logistics support of the Canadian robotic arm system on the ISS for the next 4 years. That system includes the Canadarm2, as well as a mobile base system and the Dexter manipulator. Turning to commercial space and SpaceX. A third prototype of SpaceX's Starship vehicle was destroyed in a tanking test last week. Video of the cryogenic tanking test of Starship SN3 showed that the cylindrical vehicle appeared to crumple halfway up, causing the top of the vehicle to topple. SpaceX CEO Elon Musk tweeted shortly after the incident
that the problem may have been an issue with the configuration of the test rather than a problem with the vehicle itself. 2 other Starship prototypes were destroyed in similar tanking tests last November and in late February. If this tanking test had been successful, SpaceX was planning to perform a static fire test of Starship SN3 as soon as this week, followed by a low-altitude test flight. And in Blue Origin news, some Blue Origin employees are critical of the company's plans to carry out a New Shepard test flight during the coronavirus pandemic. Several employees said they were being pressured into supporting a New Shepard test flight from the company's site in West Texas later this month. The employees were worried about the risks of exposure to COVID-19, both to themselves and to the community in Van Horn, Texas, the closest town to the test site, where employees stay during test campaigns. The company said it was continuing operations because it is considered an essential business by federal, state and local governments, but that safety is our highest value. And Virgin Orbit. The company has identified an airport in Japan as a potential launch site. Virgin Orbit said it had selected Oita Airport on the island of Kyushu as its preferred site and would soon start a technical study with Oita Prefecture, the local government, to confirm the airport's feasibility of hosting launch operations starting as soon as 2022. The airport joins sites in California, Guam and England that the company plans to perform launches from. The first Launcher 1 mission, delayed from earlier this year in part because of the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, will take place after a captive carry test flight scheduled in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, Virgin Orbit has developed a ventilator design that could be mass-produced in response to the coronavirus pandemic. The company said a bridge ventilator developed as part of a consortium led by 2 universities could be approved by the Food and Drug Administration for production at Virgin Orbit's factory soon. The bridge ventilator is a simplified version of a ventilator intended for patients with moderate symptoms of the coronavirus disease, freeing up more advanced ventilators for patients in critical condition. And over to Pete.
Thanks, Michael. In Stratolaunch news, Stratolaunch has unveiled a reusable hypersonic vehicle the company is developing. The Talon A will be launched from the company's giant aircraft and be able to fly up to Mach 7 before gliding back to a runway landing. The company describes the vehicle as a flexible high-speed testbed for a variety of hypersonic research for companies and government agencies. The vehicle will be ready for initial flights in 2022 and by 2023 could be flown 3 at a time on a single Stratolaunch flight. The company, which said earlier this year it was pivoting from orbital launch services to high-speed flight test services, said it has plans for a second hypersonic vehicle, Talon Z, and a reusable spaceplane called Black Ice, but did not disclose a timetable for either vehicle. And in other news, the coronavirus pandemic has raised interest in the use of virtual mission control capabilities rather than physical control centres. Concerns about having personnel in close proximity led European Space Agency to reduce staffing of one mission operations centre and put 4 missions on hiatus. But some companies have already used virtual systems to operate their spacecraft, allowing normal operations to continue even with stay-at-home orders in place. One company that makes a cloud-based mission control system, Kubos, is offering a free extended trial of that software to satellite operators. And both NASA and the European Space Agency are funding projects related to the pandemic. ESA announced last week it was seeking proposals from European companies interested in using ESA satellites to provide relief services such as telemedicine and education, with a particular emphasis on services in Italy. NASA is requesting proposals from researchers who want to use NASA Earth science data to study changes in the environment caused by the slowdown in activities during the pandemic or can otherwise inform decision making. Within NASA, the agency is soliciting ideas from employees about how it can support pandemic response efforts, such as producing ventilators or personal protection equipment. And finally this week, NASA astronaut Karen Nyberg is leaving the agency. Nyberg, whose last day at NASA was last week, joined the astronaut corps in 2000. She flew on STS-124 shuttle mission in 2008 and spent 5.5 months on the International Space Station in 2013 as part of the Expedition 36 and 37 crews. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you, Michael and Tina, and we'll speak to you again next week. Bye now.